In May 1945, the war in Europe ended not with a single moment of silence, but with a strange and uneasy stillness. Across the continent, the sound of engines, artillery, and gunfire faded away, yet the battlefield itself remained frozen in time. Roads were clogged with destroyed convoys, cities lay in ruins, and scattered across fields, forests, and villages were thousands of abandoned German tanks. These machines, once symbols of power and fear, now sat silent and lifeless, as if the war had simply walked away from them. Many of these tanks had not been destroyed in combat. Instead, they were left behind during the final chaotic weeks of the war. German forces, retreating on multiple fronts, were collapsing under immense pressure. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. Crews were often forced to abandon perfectly functional tanks simply because they had no gasoline left. In other cases, mechanical breakdowns made recovery impossible. Spare parts were scarce, repair units overwhelmed, and time had run out. Imagine a Panther tank, one of the most advanced machines of its time, sitting intact on the side of a forest road. Its armor is still strong, its guns still deadly, but its fuel tank is empty. The crew, likely exhausted and aware that the war was lost, had no choice but to leave it behind. They may have destroyed the radio or disabled the engine, or perhaps they fled in such haste that they left everything untouched. Multiply this scene by thousands, and you begin to understand the scale of what the Allies encountered. As Allied troops advanced deeper into Germany and occupied territories, they were met not only by surrendering soldiers and devastated infrastructure, but by entire fields filled with abandoned armor. In some areas, tanks were so numerous that they appeared like graveyards of steel. Tigers, Panzer IVs, assault guns, all left where they last stood. Some were half hidden in mud, others positioned as if still ready to fight, their guns pointing toward an enemy that would never come. This raised immediate questions for the Allied command. Were these tanks truly abandoned, or were they traps? Could they be repaired and used again? Were there hidden dangers, booby traps, unexploded ammunition, or even German soldiers waiting nearby? The uncertainty made every approach cautious. Engineers and reconnaissance teams were sent ahead to inspect the machines before anyone dared to get too close. What they discovered was both impressive and unsettling. Many of these tanks were in remarkably good condition. Despite years of war, German engineering had produced vehicles that could still function if given the right resources. Some tanks even had ammunition stored inside, ready to be used. Others showed signs of being hastily abandoned, with personal belongings of the crew still inside, helmets, maps, even unfinished meals. But the sheer number of these abandoned machines also revealed something deeper: the complete collapse of Germany's war machine. These tanks were not just weapons, they were evidence of a system that had broken down. Logistics had failed, supply lines had disintegrated, command structures were in chaos. The presence of so many intact tanks, yet useless, told a story of an army that no longer had the ability to sustain itself. For the soldiers on the ground, the sight was unforgettable. Some described it as eerie, rows of silent giants, once feared across Europe, now reduced to relics overnight. Others saw opportunity. Each tank was a source of valuable information, materials, and even potential reuse. But before any decisions could be made, the Allies had to secure and understand what they had found. In those first days after the war, the abandoned tanks of Germany became more than just leftover weapons. They became clues about how the war had been fought, how it had been lost, and what lessons could be learned for the future. Every tank had a story of its crew, its final mission, and the moment it was left behind. And as the dust settled over Europe, one thing became clear: the war might have ended, but the legacy of these machines was only beginning. As Allied forces pushed deeper into former German-held territory, what they began to encounter went far beyond isolated abandoned vehicles. Entire regions had transformed into vast graveyards of armored machines. In fields, along highways, inside forests, and on the outskirts of shattered towns, hundreds upon hundreds of tanks stood motionless. It was as if the final phase of the war had left behind a frozen landscape of steel. In some areas, the concentration was so dense that soldiers could walk for miles surrounded by wrecked or abandoned armor. These were not just scattered remnants of battle, but entire formations that had collapsed in place. Columns of tanks stretched along roads, many positioned nose to tail, suggesting they had been part of organized retreats that suddenly came to a halt. Some vehicles were burned-out shells, their armor blackened and twisted by explosions. Others, surprisingly, appeared almost untouched, their paint still visible beneath layers of dust and mud. One of the most striking aspects of these tank graveyards was how many of the vehicles had not been destroyed by enemy fire. Instead, they had been rendered useless by circumstances. Mechanical failures were a constant problem, especially for more advanced German tanks. The Panther and Tiger, while powerful, were complex machines that required regular maintenance. By the final months of the war, Germany no longer had the industrial capacity or logistical stability to keep them running. Engines broke down, transmissions failed, and there were simply not enough spare parts to fix them. Fuel shortages played an even greater role. By 1945, Germany's access to oil had been severely limited. Allied bombing campaigns had targeted refineries and supply lines, cutting off the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. Tanks that once dominated battlefields became immobile the moment their fuel ran out. Crews often had to make a difficult decision: stay with a powerless vehicle and risk capture, or abandon it and attempt to escape on foot. In most cases, survival meant leaving the tank behind. There were also signs of desperation in how some of these vehicles were left. In certain locations, tanks had been deliberately sabotaged by their own crews. Gun barrels were damaged, optics smashed, and engines disabled to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. But in many other cases, there was no time even for that. The speed of the Allied advance forced German units to retreat rapidly, sometimes overnight. Tanks were left exactly where they stopped, as if the war had been interrupted mid-movement. For Allied soldiers, encountering these graveyards was both fascinating and unsettling. At first, every abandoned tank was approached with extreme caution. There was always the possibility of hidden dangers, booby traps, unexploded shells, or even enemy soldiers hiding nearby. Engineers and specialized teams were tasked with inspecting each vehicle, ensuring it was safe before others could examine it more closely. As they moved through these areas, soldiers began to notice patterns. Tanks clustered near crossroads or bridges indicated points where retreats had stalled. Vehicles scattered across open terrain suggested chaotic withdrawals under pressure. In forests, some tanks had been concealed, possibly in preparation for ambushes that never happened. Each location told a different story, revealing fragments of the final days of the war. The scale of these graveyards also highlighted the intensity of the conflict's final phase. This was not an orderly conclusion, but a collapse. Entire armored divisions had effectively disintegrated, leaving behind their equipment as silent witnesses. The once feared German Panzer forces, which had swept across Europe in the early years of the war, were now reduced to rows of abandoned machines. Yet these graveyards were not just scenes of destruction, they were also sources of opportunity. Allied commanders quickly realized that these tanks represented a wealth of material and information. Even damaged vehicles could provide valuable components. Intact tanks offered a chance to study German engineering up close. Every piece of armor, every mechanical system, and every design choice could reveal insights into how these machines had been built and how they had performed in combat. For many soldiers, walking through these fields of steel left a lasting impression. The silence was often described as overwhelming. Where there had once been noise, movement, and danger, there was now only stillness. The tanks, once symbols of power and fear, had become monuments to a war that had ended abruptly and completely. But beneath that silence, there was a growing sense that these machines still had a role to play. They were no longer weapons in a conflict, but they were far from useless. In the days and weeks that followed, the Allies would begin to examine them more closely, uncovering secrets that would shape the future of armored warfare. The graveyards of tanks were not just the end of a story, they were the beginning of a new one.
As the initial shock of encountering vast fields of abandoned German armor began to fade, the focus of the Allies shifted from caution to curiosity. These machines were no longer seen only as remnants of a defeated enemy, but as valuable sources of knowledge. Hidden within their steel hulls were answers to questions that had defined years of brutal combat. How had these tanks been built? What made them so effective? And perhaps most importantly, how could that knowledge be used in the future? Specialized teams of engineers, mechanics, and intelligence officers were quickly organized to examine the captured vehicles. Their task was methodical and precise. Each tank was carefully inspected, documented, and, when possible, transported to secure locations for deeper analysis. The process was not rushed. Every detail mattered, from the thickness and angle of the armor to the design of the suspension and the layout of internal components. One of the first things that stood out was the emphasis German engineers had placed on armor design. Rather than relying solely on thicker plates, many German tanks used sloped armor to increase effective protection. This design choice made it more difficult for enemy shells to penetrate, as incoming rounds were more likely to deflect. Allied engineers studied these angles closely, measuring and recording them, recognizing that this approach offered protection without significantly increasing weight. The guns mounted on these tanks were another major point of interest. German tank cannons were known for their power and accuracy, capable of engaging targets at long distances. By examining the construction of these weapons, including the barrel length, recoil systems, and ammunition types, Allied experts began to understand how German tanks had been able to dominate certain battlefields. Test firings were conducted whenever possible, using captured ammunition to evaluate performance under controlled conditions. But it wasn't just the visible features that drew attention. Inside the tanks, the complexity of German engineering became even more apparent. The internal layout revealed how crews operated in tight spaces, how ammunition was stored, and how communication systems were integrated. Radios, in particular, were studied carefully. Effective communication had been a key advantage for German armored units, allowing them to coordinate movements and react quickly during combat. At the same time, these inspections also revealed weaknesses. While German tanks were often powerful and well-armed, they were also complicated and difficult to maintain. The more advanced models required significant upkeep, and their reliability suffered as a result. Allied engineers noted that certain components were prone to failure, especially under prolonged use or in harsh conditions. This balance between performance and practicality became a critical point of analysis. In some cases, the Allies went beyond simple inspection and moved into reverse engineering. Entire tanks were disassembled piece by piece. Components were removed, studied, and sometimes replicated. The goal was not just to understand how these machines worked, but to learn how to improve upon them. Factories and research facilities in multiple countries received parts and technical data, contributing to a broader effort to advance armored vehicle design. There was also a sense of urgency behind this work. Although the war in Europe had ended, the global situation remained uncertain. Military planners were already thinking about the future, aware that the next conflict could emerge at any time. The knowledge gained from studying German tanks could provide a significant advantage in whatever came next. For the soldiers and engineers involved, this work often felt like uncovering hidden secrets. Each tank was a puzzle, and every discovery added another piece to a larger picture. Why had certain design choices been made? What problems were they trying to solve, and how successful had those solutions been in real combat situations? The answers were not always straightforward. Some features that appeared impressive on the surface proved less effective in practice. Others, initially overlooked, revealed unexpected advantages. The process required patience, experimentation, and a willingness to challenge assumptions. It was not enough to simply admire or criticize the designs. What mattered was understanding them fully. As weeks turned into months, the accumulated knowledge began to influence new ideas. Tank designs in the post-war period started to reflect lessons learned from these captured machines. Improvements in armor, firepower, and mobility were all shaped in part by what had been discovered inside those abandoned German vehicles. What was once feared on the battlefield was now being carefully dissected and studied. The transformation was striking. Tanks that represented danger and destruction were now tools for learning and progress. Their role had completely changed, but their importance had not diminished. In the end, these inspections were about more than just machines. They were about understanding the evolution of warfare itself. By studying the strengths and weaknesses of German tank design, the Allies were not only analyzing the past, they were preparing for the future.
Once the initial inspections were complete and the technical secrets of German tanks began to unfold, the Allies faced a new and very practical question. What should be done with the thousands of machines now under their control? Leaving them scattered across Europe was not an option. These tanks, whether damaged or intact, represented both a potential resource and a logistical challenge on an enormous scale. In the immediate aftermath of the war, priority was given to clearing roads, cities, and strategic areas. Abandoned tanks often blocked key routes, making transportation and reconstruction efforts more difficult. Recovery teams were sent out to move or dismantle these vehicles. In some cases, tanks were simply pushed off roads into ditches or fields. In others, they were towed away using heavy equipment, a difficult task given their weight and the often poor condition of the terrain. As the situation stabilized, a more organized approach began to take shape. The Allies started categorizing the captured tanks based on their condition. Some were beyond repair, burned out, heavily damaged, or stripped of essential components. These were marked for scrapping. Others, however, were in surprisingly good condition. With minor repairs and proper maintenance, they could be made operational again. These vehicles quickly became the focus of a different kind of attention. Several Allied nations saw an opportunity in these usable tanks. Instead of destroying them, they chose to put them back into service. In the immediate post-war period, rebuilding armies from scratch would have taken time and resources that many countries simply did not have. Captured German equipment offered a temporary solution. Tanks were repaired, repainted, and in some cases even integrated into regular military units. France, for example, made notable use of captured German tanks in the years following the war. With much of its own military infrastructure damaged or depleted, the ability to reuse these machines provided a short-term boost to its armored forces. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, Soviet forces and Allied states also made use of captured equipment, either for training purposes or limited operational roles. These tanks, once symbols of German power, were now serving entirely different flags. At the same time, large-scale scrapping operations began across Europe. The sheer quantity of abandoned tanks meant that recycling them became an industrial effort. Steel was in high demand for reconstruction, and these vehicles provided a ready source of valuable material. Specialized facilities were set up where tanks were cut apart, melted down, and repurposed. What had once been weapons of war were transformed into raw materials for rebuilding cities, bridges, and infrastructure. This process was not always quick or easy. Tanks were complex machines, and dismantling them required time, labor, and expertise. Some vehicles were stripped for useful components before being scrapped. Engines, transmissions, and other parts were removed and either studied further or reused where possible. Even smaller elements like tools and fittings were salvaged whenever they had practical value. There were also cases where tanks found more unusual second lives. In certain regions, abandoned vehicles were repurposed for civilian use. Their heavy armor and durable construction made them suitable for improvised roles, such as stationary power units or even makeshift shelters. While these uses were less common, they reflected the resourcefulness of people trying to rebuild in the aftermath of destruction. Despite these efforts, not all tanks were immediately dealt with. In remote or heavily damaged areas, some vehicles remained untouched for years. Over time, they became part of the landscape, slowly rusting, overgrown with vegetation, and fading into the background. For local populations, they were constant reminders of a conflict that had reshaped their world. For the Allies, the handling of these tanks was not just about practicality, it was also about control. Ensuring that these machines could not be used again in any hostile capacity was a priority. Even when tanks were reused, it was done under strict supervision and within controlled frameworks. The goal was to eliminate any possibility that remnants of the German war machine could pose a future threat. As months turned into years, the number of abandoned tanks steadily decreased. Roads were cleared, scrapyards filled and emptied, and the visible signs of war began to fade. Yet the impact of these machines did not disappear. Through reuse, recycling, and redistribution, they continued to play a role in shaping the post-war world. What made this phase particularly striking was the transformation of purpose. Tanks that had once been designed for destruction were now contributing, in different ways, to reconstruction and recovery. Whether melted down into steel beams or repainted under a new flag, they were no longer instruments of conflict, but part of the process of rebuilding. In the end, the fate of these abandoned tanks reflected a broader reality of the post-war period. Nothing was wasted if it could be used again. Every piece of metal, every functioning component, and every intact vehicle represented an opportunity. And in a world trying to recover from years of devastation, those opportunities were too valuable to ignore.
Decades have passed since the last shots of the war echoed across Europe. Yet the legacy of Germany's abandoned tanks continues to capture the imagination of historians, engineers, and enthusiasts alike. While most of these machines were dismantled, recycled, or repurposed in the immediate post-war years, a number survived and went on to tell their own stories. Museums, private collections, and restoration projects became guardians of these steel giants, preserving them as reminders of both innovation and destruction. Restoration efforts often revealed just how advanced German engineering had been. Tanks that had once been feared on the battlefield could, with painstaking work, be returned to full operational condition. Volunteers and experts would spend years disassembling rusted components, fabricating missing parts, and carefully repainting them in historically accurate camouflage patterns. In some cases, engines roared to life again, not for war, but for historical demonstrations and exhibitions. Seeing a Tiger or Panther tank move under its own power decades later is more than a visual spectacle. It's a tangible link to a complex and often tragic past. The story of these tanks also extends beyond technical fascination. They have become symbols of the rapid collapse and overwhelming scale of Germany's defeat. Each surviving vehicle tells a story of the soldiers who crewed it, the battles it fought, and the chaos of the final months of the war. Exhibits often include personal artifacts recovered from tanks, such as helmets, maps, and manuals.
humanizing the machines and connecting visitors to the individuals who lived and sometimes died inside them. Beyond museums, some tanks have entered popular culture, inspiring books, films, and documentaries. Their appearances on screens large and small remind us of the technological and psychological impact they once held. But rather than glorifying war, these depictions often emphasize the human and mechanical challenges of armored warfare, illustrating both the ingenuity of design and the cost of conflict. The fascination extends to historians, model builders, and engineers who meticulously study blueprints, operational manuals, and surviving examples to gain insights into wartime innovation and industrial capability. Interestingly, the study of these tanks has also influenced modern armored warfare. Lessons learned from their design, armor, and weapon systems contributed to post-war tank development in several countries. Engineers analyzed how armor thickness and sloping could improve protection, how suspension systems affected mobility, and how ammunition storage impacted crew safety. In this way, the abandoned German tanks had an indirect yet lasting impact on military strategy and vehicle design well into the second half of the 20th century. Walking through a museum or a restored battlefield today, it's easy to forget that these silent giants were once at the center of life and death struggles. Their massive frames, intricate mechanics, and imposing presence offer more than just visual spectacle. They are testaments to a time when industrial engineering, military ambition, and human determination collided in ways both awe-inspiring and devastating. They also serve as educational tools, giving new generations a tactile understanding of history, mechanical design, and wartime decision-making. Ultimately, the abandoned German tanks are more than historical artifacts. They are touchstones for reflection, education, and remembrance. They remind us of the consequences of technological advancement when paired with war, of the human cost behind every strategic decision, and of the enduring power of machines to shape history long after the battles have ended. In the end, the story of these tanks is one of transformation, from weapons of war to instruments of memory, from instruments of fear to tools for learning, preservation, and reflection. They stand as silent witnesses, challenging each generation to understand the past, acknowledge its lessons, and consider how the legacy of conflict continues to shape our world today. Their continued study, restoration, and display ensure that the experiences of those who built, crewed, and fought these machines will never be forgotten, preserving history in a form that is both tangible and powerful.